There is a vegetable that Victorian gardeners grew in complete darkness, and it tasted better than anything modern agriculture produces today. No sunlight, no grow lights, no LED systems, no electricity of any kind, just absolute blackness, and a technique so simple that gardeners 200 years ago mastered it without any scientific training. The vegetable that emerged from this darkness was tender beyond description. It was sweet when modern varieties are bitter. It was crisp when store-bought versions are stringy. It was so delicious that wealthy families paid premium prices for what poor farmers could produce in dirt. Cellars with zero technology, they called it blanched celery. And for over a century, it was considered the only way to grow celery worth eating. Then something changed. The modern produce industry needed vegetables that could survive shipping. They needed crops that could sit in warehouses for weeks. They needed varieties that looked good under fluorescent lights, even if they tasted like cardboard. They bred the tenderness out of celery. They sacrificed flavor for shelf life. They replaced a vegetable that required skill and patience with one that required nothing except tolerance for mediocrity. The blanching technique disappeared from gardening knowledge within a single generation. Today, Americans eat over 1 billion pounds of celery annually. Almost none of it has been blanched. Almost none of it tastes like what celery is supposed to taste like. Almost nobody alive remembers that celery was once considered a delicacy rather than a diet food. The technique is not lost, it is buried. Buried because darkness farming cannot be industrialized. Buried because skill-based growing cannot be scaled. Buried because a vegetable anyone can improve in their backyard threatens an industry built on selling you the worst possible version. This is the story of blanched celery, the darkness technique that transforms a bitter vegetable into something extraordinary. The Victorian method that modern agriculture abandoned, and the reason why the simplest improvement in your garden is the one they never want you to discover. Before we open this vault, if these stories matter to you, the best way to preserve this knowledge is simple. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share these vaults with those who need to remember what we forgot. The first thing you need to understand is that the celery you know is not real celery. The pale green stalks sitting in grocery store produce sections are a shadow of what this vegetable once was. They have been bred for uniformity, for shipping durability, for visual appeal under artificial lighting. They have not been bred for flavor. They have not been bred for texture. They have not been bred for nutrition. The result is a vegetable that most people eat only because they believe it has negative calories. Not because it tastes good. Not because they enjoy it. Because they think chewing it burns more energy than it provides. This is what modern agriculture has done to celery. But visit any gardener over 80 years old, ask them about celery. Watch their eyes change when they remember what it used to taste like. They will tell you about sweetness. They will describe tenderness that melted in the mouth. They will recall a vegetable so flavorful that it was served as a featured dish, not hidden in soup or drowned in peanut butter. They are remembering blanched celery. The technique dates back at least 300 years in European gardening. By the Victorian era, it had been refined into an art form that every serious gardener practiced. The principle is simple. Celery develops bitterness and toughness through exposure to sunlight. Chlorophyll production hardens the cell walls. Compounds that taste harsh accumulate in exposed tissues. The more light celery receives, the more it tastes like the cardboard stalks you buy today. Remove the light, and everything changes. In darkness, celery cannot produce chlorophyll. The stalks remain pale, almost white. The cell walls stay tender. The bitter compounds never develop. What emerges is a completely different vegetable than what grows in full sun. Victorian gardeners discovered this through careful observation. They noticed that celery buried under soil tasted better than celery left exposed. They experimented with different methods of excluding light. They refined their techniques over generations until blanching became standard practice. By 1850, no serious gardener would consider serving unblanched celery. The technique was considered so essential that gardening books of the era devoted entire chapters to blanching methods. Competitions judged celery not by size but by tenderness and sweetness. The best blanched celery commanded prices that working families could not afford. This was celery as a luxury vegetable, a delicacy worthy of the finest tables. Then the 20th century arrived, and everything changed. The industrialization of celery production made blanching economically impossible. Consider what blanching requires. Each plant must be individually wrapped, buried, or covered. The process is labor-intensive. it cannot be mechanized. A single worker might blanch a few hundred plants per day. Modern celery operations plant millions of plants per season. The economics do not work. The labor costs would exceed the value of the crop. Industrial agriculture cannot accommodate techniques that require individual attention to individual plants. So they abandoned blanching entirely. Instead, they bred new varieties that were less bitter without blanching, varieties that stayed lighter green naturally, varieties that tolerated the abuse of mechanical harvesting and long-distance shipping. They called this progress. The new varieties were ready for harvest faster. They produced more uniform stalks. They survived refrigerated transport from California to New York. They also tasted significantly worse. The breeders had reduced the most offensive bitterness, but they had not eliminated it. They had created celery that was acceptable rather than exceptional, edible rather than delicious. The industry decided acceptable was good enough. Marketing shifted the narrative. Celery was no longer sold as a flavorful vegetable. It was sold as a health food, a low-calorie snack, a vehicle for dips and spreads that provided the flavor celery itself no longer offered. Within 2 generations, the memory of blanched celery faded. Gardening books stopped teaching the technique. Seed catalogs stopped mentioning it. The knowledge that had been essential for centuries became obscure trivia that only the oldest gardeners remembered. The industry had successfully convinced everyone that inferior celery was normal celery, that bitterness was an inherent characteristic rather than a preventable flaw, that the vegetable their grandparents considered a delicacy was now diet food. The transformation was complete. The science of blanching explains exactly why it works so dramatically. Celery belongs to the Apiaceae family, which includes carrots, parsley, and fennel. All of these plants produce compounds called pheronocoumarins when exposed to light. These compounds serve as natural sunscreen, protecting plant tissues from UV damage. Pheronocoumarins taste bitter to humans. The more light exposure celery receives, the more pheronocoumarins it produces. The more pheronocoumarins present, the more bitter the celery tastes. The relationship is direct and measurable. Blanching interrupts this process completely. In darkness, celery has no need for UV protection. Pheronocoumarin production drops to nearly zero. The bitter compounds that define modern celery's taste simply never develop. But bitterness reduction is only part of the transformation. Light exposure also triggers lignification, the hardening of cell walls that gives plants structural strength. Lignin makes celery stalks fibrous and stringy. It creates the unpleasant texture that requires aggressive chewing. Blanched celery produces minimal lignin. The stalks remain tender throughout their structure. The texture becomes almost creamy rather than fibrous. The strings that catch between your teeth largely disappear. The color change reflects these chemical differences. Green chlorophyll requires light for production. Without light, celery stalks remain white or pale yellow. This is not merely cosmetic. The absence of chlorophyll correlates with the absence of bitterness and the presence of tenderness. Victorian gardeners did not understand the chemistry. They understood the results. They knew that darkness produced superior vegetables, even if they could not explain why. Modern science has validated their empirical knowledge completely. The techniques they developed work for exactly the reasons chemistry predicts. Their methods were not superstition. They were practical application of principles that would not be scientifically explained for another century. The traditional blanching methods remain available to anyone willing to use them. The simplest approach is hilling. As celery plants grow, soil is mounded around the stalks progressively higher. The buried portions receive no light. They blanch naturally while the plant continues growing above the soil line. This method requires repeated attention through the growing season. Every few weeks, more soil is added. The hilling continues until only the leafy tops remain exposed. The result is celery blanched from the base upward. The lowest portions are palest and most tender. The transition from blanched to unblanched is gradual. The wrapping method provides more complete blanching. Paper, cardboard, or other opaque material is wrapped around each celery plant from base to leaves. The entire stalk receives darkness while the leaves continue photosynthesizing to keep the plant alive. This method requires more materials but less ongoing labor. Once wrapped, plants can be left to blanch for 2 to 3 weeks before harvest. The trenching method was the Victorian gold standard. Celery is planted in trenches 12 to 18 inches deep. As plants grow, boards are placed across the trench, creating complete darkness. The celery grows upward in total blackness, producing the palest and most tender stalks possible. This method requires the most initial preparation, but produces the most dramatic results. Trench-grown blanched celery was the premium product that wealthy families sought. Modern gardeners have added new materials to these traditional methods. Corrugated plastic tubes slipped over celery plants provide easy, reusable blanching. Landscape fabric wrapped around plants excludes light while allowing air circulation. Even newspaper secured with rubber bands works effectively. The principle remains constant across all methods. Exclude light, allowed 2 to 3 weeks. Harvest something incomparably better than what you started with. The techniques require no special equipment, no electricity, no expertise beyond basic gardening skills. Anyone who can grow celery can blanch celery. The only requirement is knowing that blanching exists. The flavor transformation from blanching must be experienced to be believed. Unblanched celery has a sharp vegetal taste that most people tolerate rather than enjoy. It serves as a delivery vehicle for other flavors. Nobody eats plain unblanched celery for pleasure. Blanched celery is an entirely different food. The sweetness emerges first. Sugars that were masked by bitter compounds become perceptible. The taste is almost fruity, reminiscent of the celery's relationship to carrots and parsley. The texture follows the flavor. Where unblanched celery requires aggressive chewing, blanched celery yields easily. The bite is crisp but tender. The strings that define modern celery are absent or minimal. The aromatic quality intensifies. Blanched celery has a perfume-like fragrance that unblanched celery lacks. The same aromatic compounds exist in both, but bitterness masks them in unblanched stalks. Remove the bitterness, and the aromatics become prominent. Victorian recipes reflect this flavor profile. Blanched celery was braised in butter and served as a side dish. It was creamed and presented as a featured vegetable. It appeared in salads where its sweetness complemented rather than competed with other ingredients. These preparations make no sense with modern unblanched celery. Braising modern celery in butter produces limp, bitter stalks. Creaming it creates an unpleasant dish. The recipes failed not because they were wrong, but because the ingredient changed. The disconnect between Victorian celery recipes and modern celery explains why so many heritage recipes have been abandoned. Cooks attempting grandmother celery dishes with store-bought celery produce disappointing results. They blame the recipe. They should blame the celery. Blanch the celery first, and the recipes work again. The techniques were developed for blanched celery. They require blanched celery. They reveal what celery can be when grown properly. The nutritional implications of blanching deserve examination. Modern nutritional advice emphasizes dark green vegetables. Chlorophyll is associated with health benefits. Blanched vegetables seem nutritionally inferior based on color alone. This assumption is incomplete. Blanched celery retains most vitamins and minerals present in unblanched celery. The potassium remains, the folate remains, the vitamin K remains. What changes is the compound profile that affects taste and digestibility. The furanocoumarins, reduced by blanching, have complicated health effects. In some contexts, they are beneficial. In others, they cause photosensitive skin reactions. Their reduction is not clearly harmful. The reduced lignin in blanched celery may actually improve nutrient availability. Hard cell walls limit digestive access to cellular contents. Tender cell walls release nutrients more readily. The minerals and vitamins in blanched celery may be more bioavailable than those in fibrous unblanched stalks. Most importantly, blanched celery gets eaten. The healthiest vegetable in the world provides no nutrition if it sits uneaten in refrigerator drawers. The most nutrient-dense food is worthless if people avoid it because it tastes bad. Blanched celery gets eaten because it tastes good. Children who refuse unblanched celery eat blanched celery willingly. Adults who tolerate unblanched celery enjoy blanched celery genuinely. The transformation from obligation to pleasure changes consumption patterns entirely. A slightly less nutrient-dense vegetable that people actually eat provides more nutrition than a maximally nutrient-dense vegetable that they avoid. This practical nutrition matters more than theoretical nutrition. The modern-led farming industry represents everything blanching is not. Vertical farms spend millions on lighting systems. They consume enormous electricity to provide artificial sunlight. They tout technological sophistication as their primary selling point. Blanching uses zero electricity. It requires zero technology. It has worked for 300 years. The LED farming industry charges premium prices for produce grown under artificial conditions. The costs of lighting, climate control, and infrastructure must be recovered through high retail prices. Blanching costs nearly nothing, a few sheets of newspaper, some soil moved around plants. Time. The LED farming industry requires massive capital investment. Only well-funded corporations can participate. The technology creates barriers to entry that exclude ordinary people. Blanching requires a backyard, some seeds, basic gardening knowledge. Anyone can participate. The LED farming industry produces celery, visually identical to field-grown celery, the same pale green stalks, the same bitter flavor, the same stringy texture. Technological sophistication has not improved the product. Blanching produces celery visually distinct from anything available commercially. White or pale yellow stalks. Sweet flavor, tender texture. Simple technique has transformed the product completely. The contrast reveals something important about modern agriculture. Technology is applied to logistics, not quality. The goal is shipping durability, not eating pleasure. Innovation serves corporate needs, not human preferences. Blanching serves human preferences exclusively. It makes vegetables taste better. It makes eating more enjoyable. It improves the fundamental experience of food. The produce industry cannot monetize blanching. They cannot patent darkness. They cannot sell the absence of light. So they promote LED farming instead. Technology, they can sell. Infrastructure, they can finance. Systems that create dependency rather than capability. Meanwhile, a technique older than electricity waits for anyone willing to use it. The revival of blanching has begun in unexpected places. High-end restaurants have rediscovered blanched vegetables as points of differentiation. Chefs seeking flavors unavailable through commercial supply chains have returned to heritage techniques. Blanched celery appears on tasting menus at prices that would have astonished Victorian gardeners. The vegetable that was once common in every serious garden is now rare enough to command premium positioning. Home gardeners are following the restaurant revival. Seed catalogs have begun mentioning blanching again. Gardening blogs feature blanching tutorials. YouTube videos demonstrate traditional techniques with modern materials. The knowledge that nearly disappeared is being recovered. Farmers markets provide another avenue for blanched celery commerce. Small growers can implement blanching at scales that remain economically viable. The labor intensity that makes industrial blanching impossible makes small farm blanching feasible. Direct marketing allows farmers to educate consumers about what blanched celery is and why it costs more than commercial celery. The education creates appreciation. The appreciation justifies premium pricing. The market for exceptional vegetables is growing, while the market for acceptable vegetables commoditizes. Consumers who have tasted real blanched celery do not return to commercial celery willingly. The flavor gap is too wide. The experience too different. Once you know what celery can taste like, tolerating what it usually tastes like becomes difficult. This is the threat that blanching poses to industrial agriculture. Not competition for the same product. Competition from a superior product that industrial methods cannot replicate. A quality difference that no amount of marketing can obscure once consumers have experienced it. Growing and blanching celery at home requires patience more than skill. Celery seeds are tiny and slow to germinate. Start them indoors 10 to 12 weeks before the last frost date. Keep the soil consistently moist and provide bottom heat if possible. Transplant seedlings outdoors after hardening off. Space plants 6 to 8 inches apart in rows. Provide consistent moisture throughout the growing season. Celery is a heavy feeder that benefits from rich soil and regular fertilization. Begin blanching 2 to 3 weeks before intended harvest. For hilling, mound soil around stalks progressively, leaving only the leafy tops exposed. For wrapping, use any opaque material secured around the entire stalk. For trenching, cover the plants with boards or other light-excluding materials. The timing matters. Blanch too early and plants may fail to size up properly. Blanch too late and lignification has already made stalks fibrous. The window is forgiving, but not unlimited. Harvest by cutting stalks at soil level, use immediately, or store in refrigerator for up to 2 weeks. Blanched celery is more perishable than unblanched celery because the tender cell walls are more vulnerable to decay. The increased perishability explains why industrial agriculture abandoned blanching. Vegetables that spoil quickly cannot survive supply chains designed for weeks of transit and storage. The quality that makes blanched celery delicious makes it commercially impractical. This is exactly why home gardeners can produce what industry cannot. Gardens are not supply chains. Home harvest means immediate consumption. The limitations that make blanching impossible commercially make it advantageous domestically. The home gardener can produce vegetables that no amount of money can purchase, quality that exists outside commercial possibility, flavor that disappeared from the market a century ago. The story of blanched celery is not just about gardening technique. It is about what gets lost when efficiency replaces quality. Industrial agriculture optimized for scale, for shipping, for storage, for profit margin. It did not optimize for flavor, for tenderness, for the actual experience of eating. The celery that filled grocery stores was good enough. It was acceptable. It was edible, if not enjoyable. And because it was good enough, the techniques that produced something better were abandoned. The knowledge was not lost. It was surrendered, traded for convenience that served producers more than consumers. Blanching represents a different relationship with food. It requires attention. It requires patience. It requires caring about the outcome beyond simple harvest weight. The reward for this attention is flavor that modern agriculture cannot match, texture that industrial breeding has eliminated, quality that exists only through technique, not technology. Every garden that blanches celery recovers knowledge that nearly disappeared. Every gardener who tastes the difference understands what was lost. Every meal featuring blanched celery proves that better is possible. The technique that grows vegetables in total darkness illuminates what modern agriculture has done to food. It has prioritized everything except what matters to the person eating. You can change this in your garden this season. The seeds are available. The technique is simple. The darkness is free. 300 years of gardening wisdom, waiting for anyone willing to turn off the lights. If this vault opened something for you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every like and every share helps preserve this wisdom. The next vault opens soon.